Dr. Mike Licona. Hello and welcome to the channel.
Hey, thank you so much, Juan. I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad you could make it. You know, Dale Allison says that out of all the people, Mike Licona has the best case for the resurrection. So I think it's fair to say that we are talking to the strongest resurrection defender in the world, probably. So that's very that's really.
Well, I appreciate the kind words of Dale Allison, and he's a friend of mine. I love the guy. I think Gary Habermas knows the case better than anyone. So I would defer to Gary, but that's a very kind thing of Dale to say.
Yeah. I think it's probably either one of those two, Gary Habermas or Mike Licona. Yeah. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe about your work in this topic? I know you wrote a book, and you also have a YouTube channel. So yeah, why don't you start with that?
Well, I guess the story goes back to my final semester in grad school back in 1985. I was completing a Master of Arts degree in New Testament studies, and I focused all my attention on learning how to read Greek. And I took as many courses as I could, about 10 graduate level courses on Koine Greek and all that kind of stuff, and just spending hours studying the Greek New Testament. And one day I just asked myself, how do I know this stuff is true? I believe it's true. I believe I've had prayers answered, that I have a relationship with the Lord, but do people of other religions likewise think that they have a relationship with God? And am I deceiving myself? Have I talked my way into this, into believing this? How do I know Christianity is true? And I had been aware of Christian apologetics, but I just wasn't interested in it, to be honest with you. I didn't need it until I needed it. And so one of my roommates suggested I see Gary Habermas. I'd never had Gary as a professor. He's a philosophy professor. And I went and saw him, and he spent about 20 minutes with me. I'm guessing it was about 20 minutes, and talked to me about the resurrection of Jesus, and gave me just a short thing, and it reaffirmed my faith and gave me confidence, and I walked out of his office. But a few years later, I began questioning my faith again, and then again at another time. And so I was blessed that Gary was willing to spend some time with me and kind of guide me with some questions and point me in the right direction. So we ended up co-authoring a book together, but even after that, I decided I wanted to go deeper with it, and I wanted to investigate it as a historian would. And so that's what my doctoral work was on. That's what got me involved. And even during my doctoral research, I was reading what general historians and philosophers of history were saying, that there's no such thing as an unbiased historian. None. There is no unbiased historian. There are no historians that are entirely objective. And those biases, the subjectivity in historical investigation definitely has the potential to compromise one's investigation. And so I recognized, well, yeah, that's me too. That impacts me. And so, I determined at that point that as someone who had experienced doubts, that I wanted to do my research with as much integrity as I could have and tried to be as objective as possible. So I've worked pretty hard at it. And, my wife and Gary and William Lane Craig and my doctoral supervisor could testify about how I really wrestled with it and was definitely open to jettisoning my faith. But in the end, I really believed that Jesus rose from the dead, and that historical investigation really pointed in that direction. So that's kind of like my story there, and what got me interested in this topic.
That's great. Thank you. And you wrote a great book. I'm going to put a link to the description, guys. So if you want to buy it, can go make sure to check it out. So, okay, so let's start with a simple question. What would you say is like an elevator pitch for the historical case for the resurrection?
Well, I'd start off and I'd say something like, there's a lot of things on which scholars, which historians disagree, a lot of things. And what some would consider facts, others will not grant as facts. So if we want to make this simple, let's just look at some facts that are granted by virtually all. They're so strongly supported by the data that even very skeptical historians have been willing to grant them as facts. This would be things like Jesus' death by crucifixion, that shortly after his death, a number of his followers had experiences they interpreted as appearances of the risen Jesus, that some of these experiences occurred to groups, and also that there was a persecutor of the church, a guy who was not a Christian. He was out trying to destroy the Christian church, named Paul, and he converted to Christianity when he had an experience he was convinced was the risen Jesus who had appeared to him. So these are things that most scholars agree on. And so the task of the historian is to come up with the best explanation for these. And so, you look at things like legend, metaphor, lies, hallucinations, things like that, and resurrection, and you test these and you see which one best explains the facts. And by far, the resurrection hypothesis is the only one that can do an adequate job. So that'd be my elevator defense of the resurrection.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much. That's great. So I will say that broadly, there are like two things that we have to explain, or skeptics have to explain. One is the empty tomb, and the other one is like the appearances of Jesus. So let's take a look at the first one. With regards to the empty tomb, I will say that there are two main kind of camps in skeptics. There are some that grant the empty tomb. I'm going to show just something here. Yeah, the one, they grant the empty tomb. They think the tomb was found empty. And the second camp is those who think that the story was invented, right? And maybe the burial was invented.
Yeah.
So let's start with number one. Number one, you have, for example, James Fodor saying that maybe Joseph of Arimathea meant to temporarily store the body of Jesus, and he somehow moved the body, and somehow the disciples didn't get the memo, and there was some kind of weird confusion that led to this problem. And another, for example, Dale Allison says that if he was a skeptic, he thinks that the best naturalistic scenario that he will propose is to say that somebody stole the body, and then this triggered some hallucinations on this group of followers. So that's one option. So what do you think about this? Do you think like how plausible is it that maybe somebody stole the body or something?
Well, there is decent evidence for the empty tomb. In fact, even the critics whose writings and traces of writings we have survived, they seem to grant the empty tomb. They just have alternative explanations for it. It's like at the end of Matthew, it says the Jewish leaders were saying the disciples had stolen the body. Justin Martyr, in the middle of the 2nd century, says in his dialogue with the Jew Trypho, you yourself know that the Jewish leaders have chosen and ordained certain men to go around and spread the story that the disciples had stolen the body. So they were still saying this in the middle of the 2nd century. You have Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century saying that some were saying that the gardener reburied the body. So they're not disputing the empty tomb. They are just providing alternative explanations for why the tomb was empty. But the question would be, would this have led the disciples to believe that Jesus had been raised? And it seems that the answer to that would be no. As we read the Gospels, it seems that only the beloved disciple believed based on seeing the tomb was empty. There's no reason to believe Peter when he went to the tomb, or the others, that they believed that the tomb was empty. In fact, in Luke's Gospel, it says when the women reported about the empty tomb, the disciples thought they were telling frivolous tales. John's Gospel reports that Thomas did not believe based on the empty tomb, not even based on the reports of his colleagues that they had seen the risen Jesus. So when it comes to Paul, think about him. would he have believed based on an empty tomb? And it's very doubtful he would have. In fact, because the Jewish leaders were saying that the disciples had stolen the body, then it's probable that that's what Paul believed about the empty tomb as well, that the disciples had stolen the body as the cause of its being empty. So it wouldn't have convinced him. The thing that convinced the disciples of Jesus and Paul of the resurrection is when Jesus appeared to them. It was the appearances that convinced them, not the empty tomb.
Yeah. So, and I wanted to say, the other option, the idea that I also don't like to posit that somebody stole the body, because it feels like I'm positing an implausible scenario. I am the kind of person who says that maybe the story was invented, and I even go further than that. I like to say that the burial story also was invented. Why do I do that? I had to do this because I'm gonna posit hallucinations. But if they can go check a body, then hallucinations, they are not going to work. I need a body that cannot be checked. I need to posit that.
But why is that, Juan? I mean, even if the body was still in the tomb, couldn't they have just said, they couldn't have just still had hallucinations and said, oh yeah, he's alive in spirit. The general resurrection hasn't happened yet, and so that's why he hasn't been raised. But he's still alive. He's appeared to us. It seems to me that there'd be no reason for them to have hallucinations based on an empty tomb. They would think that the body was stolen. Hallucinations might be more likely if the body was still in the tomb.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I guess I imagine that I imagine like maybe they hallucinated Jesus first, but then they go check the tomb, and it like kills the illusion in a way. I don't know. That's how I kind of see it. I don't know. Yeah, maybe some people. I hadn't thought about that.
Well,
right?
We could talk about the empty tomb just for a moment. Was it invented? Of course, none of us can get in the time machine and go back and verify, right? So we have to look at what does the data say, and what do we think is the best explanation for it. You look at Paul's writings, and he seems pretty clearly to believe in a physical bodily resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
So, for example, you go to Romans 8:11. The Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. He gave life to Jesus's mortal body. He would also give life to our mortal bodies. And then a few verses later in verse 23, he says, when Christ returns, we're going to experience the redemption of our bodies. So it's talking about a physical bodily resurrection. Philippians 3:20 and 21, Paul is talking about how when we eagerly wait for Jesus to return, who at that time will transform our mortal bodies to be conformed to his glorious one. So it's a transformation of our mortal body. That's what resurrection is. And then in 1 Thessalonians, perhaps the earliest of Paul's letters, probably written around the year 50, in chapter 4, he says, look, when Christ returns, he's going to bring back with him the spirits of those who have died as believers, and then the trumpet will sound and the dead in Christ will be raised. Well, wait a minute. If he's bringing back the spirits of those who have died as believers, when he says the dead in Christ will be raised, well, isn't he bringing them back with him? Yeah. So the only way to really look at that is to say, yeah, he's bringing the spirits back, who will then be put back into their corpses, which are then resurrected, brought back to life, and then transformed into an immortal body. So this is Paul. He's talking about a physical bodily resurrection of the corpse. That is entirely consistent with an empty grave. Yeah. And then when you look at the Gospels, they are unanimous that the tomb was empty. Now, maybe you say that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their source for this. It's possible. Their stories differ enough, in at least the appearances that come after the empty tomb, that we probably have some independent reports between them. But most scholars today, critical scholars, although they think that John may very well have been familiar with Mark's gospel, they do see John as writing independently of Mark. I'd also say that based on some master's thesis that I supervised, as well as another master's thesis of a student. I didn't supervise him, but he sent it to me. Both of them surveyed about roughly 200 critical scholars writing in English since 1965. And the majority of those who comment on it seem to believe the traditional authorship of Mark, that Mark got his primary source was Peter. And although the majority of critical scholars do not accept the traditional authorship of John, that it was written by John, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' 12 disciples, they do think that it is largely based on the eyewitness testimony of one of Jesus' disciples. So you have at minimum, two gospels here that are closely rooted in eyewitness testimony, and they both testify to the empty tomb. So we do have reason to think that the empty tomb tradition is historical. And again, the critics of Christianity are saying they're providing alternative explanations to the resurrection for why the tomb is empty. No one is disputing that the tomb is empty. They're just providing other explanations for it. So I do think we've got good reason to think the tomb was empty, that it wasn't invented.
Right. Yeah. I will try to respond to that by providing some reasons of my own to explain why we can doubt the story of the burial by Joseph of Arimathea.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Can I show you? Just when I show you the slides, I will use three main arguments, like real quick. One is that the normal thing that would have happened is that Jesus' body would have been buried in a criminal's graveyard.
Can I answer that one first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay, so that would have been true outside of Jerusalem, but in Jerusalem it was different. So if you go to the writings of Josephus, Jewish War, I believe it's book 4, section 317, he's talking about in the late 60s when the Idumeans attacked Jerusalem and they killed many Jews. And Josephus reports that not only did they kill many Jews, but they refused burial for them. And Josephus says that it had been the custom of the Jews to remove criminals from their crosses and to give them a proper burial prior to sunset. So up until the late 60s, we can anticipate that the Jews would have given even criminals a proper burial, not throwing them into some kind of a pit like what the Romans did outside of Jerusalem. Okay. And we have further evidence from this with Yehohanan, whose skeletal remains were discovered in an ossuary in 1968 in Jerusalem. And they still had a nail embedded in one of his ankles, which shows he had been crucified. They also found the remains of another Jew who had been executed in Jerusalem. He'd been burned alive. They showed the grating marks on his bones, and yet he was given a proper burial as well. So while that may have worked for those criminals outside of Jerusalem, it wouldn't have applied to those Jews in the Jerusalem area.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. I had some other points. But second point, this may be not so strong. Like the characters of Joseph of Arimathea seems a bit convenient to me because he's like the evangelist has the problem. Okay, who's going to retrieve the body of Jesus? And one member of the Jewish Sanhedrin will be precisely somebody with the authority and the power to go to Pilate and get the body. And it just happens to be that he happens to be a secret disciple of Jesus. And then it gets even more convenient. Like the same man is like, I just happen to have a tomb that is nearby that had never been used by anybody. And I just have an empty tomb right now, the corner. And that seems a bit convenient to me in a way. I don't know. I mean, it's not super strong. Yeah.
Convenient doesn't bother me. I mean, okay, so it was convenient because he had just had a tomb hewn out. You could say convenient, but I mean, what if it hadn't said it had just been hewn out? He just had a family tomb and he wanted to bury Jesus in it. Would that have made a difference?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just an additional, just being a little more specific there.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think that argument is super strong, but I do think the next one is stronger.
Okay.
I think for me, this is like my own argument. I think it will be too risky for someone in the position of Joseph of Arimathea to expose himself as a secret disciple by getting that body. And if we look at Mark, they almost arrested a guy because they thought he was one of the followers of Jesus and he ran away. So it would have been dangerous to out yourself as a disciple of Jesus. So for Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Sanhedrin, to do something like that seems to me like he's risking way too much. He's risking at least his position, his job, which is very high, even more, like maybe his life. So she's like, why would he do that? That's what I would say.
Well, I think about, the first gospel, I think was probably Mark. And Mark was written sometime between 20 and 40 years after the crucifixion, is where most scholars would put it. And the majority of those would place dating to Mark somewhere between the years 65 and 70. So that would be 35 to 40 years after the crucifixion. That'd be the first gospel written. So Joseph of Arimathea could have died sometime before then. And if that's the case, well, then have been no danger to him.
Nope.
Another thing to take into consideration is, and you got Paul, he was a Pharisee climbing up the ladder within the Jewish hierarchy. And he outed himself, right? Based on an appearance, what he perceived to be an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. He gave up everything. He gave up everything and became a Christian, and then suffered by the same hands of those who he had been in with before. So Paul outed himself. If the book of Acts is preserving truth here, it also says that there were many of the Jewish priests in Jerusalem who became Christians after the resurrection of Jesus. So they outed themselves. So if you have Paul and Jewish priests doing it, why not Joseph of Arimathea?
Yeah,
that's the resurrection, so why not him?
Yeah, that's a good response. I mean, I'm not saying that Mark outed Joseph of Arimathea. I'm saying that Joseph of Arimathea will out himself when he gets the body in a very public way, like other people who have
okay.
It was Joseph. Yeah.
Well, it would, again, you would have had to have, it was the custom at that point, according to Josephus, to remove the criminals, the crucified, from their crosses and bury them prior to sunset. So who's going to do that? Yeah. Well, Joseph of Arimathea plans to do that and put him in his own tomb. So, yeah, he would have been. You're correct. He would have been outing himself at that point. So yeah, my first answer there, that he might have died before then. Yeah, that's a good point, Juan. So that first answer I provided would not work. So yeah, he would have just outed himself in that sense. But remember, he's saying that it said that he was a secret disciple. So I suppose he would have just said, hey, I went to Pilate, I requested the body, we had to bury it prior to sunset. Yeah, they wouldn't have liked that. He was on the Sanhedrin, so he was high up. So yeah, others would have looked at that askance. They would not have approved, but it doesn't mean that he would have been in danger necessarily.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. So maybe we can move to the next topic. That's a very interesting topic: the appearances of Jesus.
Okay.
And the more interesting ones are the group appearances, because these are the ones that are much harder to explain for the skeptic. And with the ones in the Gospels, the skeptic can say a little bit, they're a bit easier to dismiss. The skeptic can say, well, these are legendary embellishments. They were written 40 years, many decades after the events, like the stories evolve over time, or but the ones of Paul, these are tricky. They're not so easy to explain. because Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, he also mentions like probably group appearances. And I have, so these stories go back much earlier. They didn't evolve like many years later, right? They were there from the beginning, those reports.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not so easy to explain. I think it's not so easy to explain that. Some skeptics are a bit too quick to dismiss that, but I have some options here.
Okay.
What options are available? Who could say, okay, Paul was lying, but that's unlikely. Paul has all the signs of being honest, so that doesn't work. One could maybe say, okay, maybe somebody lied to Paul, right, about this, some Christian. The problem is that Paul met with the disciples later, and he will have compared notes, and he will have done, they will have come up, right? That I don't think that really works. A third option, one could try and say, okay, Paul doesn't necessarily say that Jesus appeared to all the disciples at once, right? But I don't like this solution. It feels, because it seems to me like the natural read of the text does imply that he appeared to all of them, like it's all of them at once. And another option, you already mentioned this, is to say that Paul is talking about a spiritual resurrection, a mental appearance or something. Yeah, I think that one, Dale Allison, in his book, he refutes that option very well. He goes very deep into the Greek and shows why that just doesn't work. So yeah, so it's not so easy to explain. Before I give you my two plausible explanations, I want to get your opinion. How confident can we be that the original disciples were reported group appearances?
That's a good question. So when Paul reports these group appearances in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, he says, this is with an oral tradition he had received at an earlier time, right? I delivered to you what I also received. And then he goes on in verses 11, 12, and 14 to refer to this oral tradition as kerygma, would be the Greek term for it, kerugma, which means the official and formal proclamation. So if he's giving this kerygma to the Corinthian church and passing this around probably to, of course, to others even outside of Corinth, where's he getting it from? Well, he had met with the Jerusalem apostles on two occasions. On one of those occasions, Galatians 2, he says he ran the gospel message past them to ensure that he was preaching the same message that they were preaching. And in verse 1 of chapter 15, 1 Corinthians, just a few verses before, verse 3, he says, I want to remind you of the gospel message I preached to you. So this is after that meeting where he had ran the gospel message past the Jerusalem apostles. And now we can know through 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7, that this is what they were proclaiming. He says, I delivered to you what I also received. Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to scriptures, that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 at one time. Paul adds, most of these people are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all of the apostles. And then Paul adds his own name to the list. What's interesting here, Juan, is Paul in Galatians chapter 1 and in Galatians chapter 2, he says he had met with Peter and James. And then in Galatians chapter 2, he adds John to that. So Galatians 1, he met with Peter and James. Galatians 2, he met with Peter, James, and John. So isn't it interesting that in this oral tradition, he says he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500, then he appeared to James. It's like, wow, where is he getting this from? He's getting it from the Jerusalem apostles. This is firsthand testimony from them. And then Paul adds his own name to that list. So it's like, this is pretty cool stuff. This is aside from the Gospels. He's getting this gospel message almost certainly from the Jerusalem apostles. And then in verse, I believe it's verse 11, he says, whether I or they, the other apostles, this is what we preach. And this is what you believe. So he's saying this is what the other Jerusalem apostles are proclaiming. The death, burial, resurrection appearances. And this is to individuals and to groups. So I think we have every reason to go. Plus, you do have the book of Acts, which have the apostles going around proclaiming that Jesus had appeared to them. And you have the group appearances in the Gospels, which even Dale Allison acknowledges. You brought up him earlier. He acknowledges in his big book on the resurrection that the resurrection narratives have some relationship, even though he believes that they have been amplified some. He's less sanguine about those appearance traditions than I am in the Gospels, but he does believe that these appearances in the Gospels, even the group appearances, have some kind of a relationship with the appearances that are described in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7. Like, he does think that there is a relationship between the appearance to the first appearance to the group of male disciples reported in Matthew, Luke, and John. There's a relationship between them and the appearance to the 12 that's reported in 1 Corinthians 15.
Yeah, these are good points. So yeah, it could be, it's plausible to say that this could go back to the disciples. In that case, I have like two odd ways to explain it. One is to say that the disciples had some kind of group experience. And the second one is proposed by Komanernitsky, which I think is one of the best skeptic books on the resurrection, just to say that the disciples lied to Paul, which not many people propose. But I actually go for the second option, but if I had to defend number one, I think Bart Ehrman has a blog post about this group appearance tip. If I had to defend number one, I think I could do something like this. Imagine modern charismatic churches, and we can see sometimes you have videos on the internet and stuff that things the crowd gets like too excited a little bit, and you have phenomena like a lot of people are talking in tongues. A lot of people say that they can feel the Holy Spirit and are doing crazy things, and you think the crowd gets a little too excited, and it's just crazy things happen. I don't know, something like that. So I would say, what if something like that happened at some point? Like, imagine the disciples are eating fish, or having dinner, or praying, or fasting. And then Peter starts getting a little too excited, and he says he can see Jesus, maybe or maybe he says he can feel Jesus. And maybe you got another person saying, "Oh yeah, me too," and maybe that's enough to start it. Maybe somebody doesn't see Jesus or feel, but he doesn't want to say anything. He doesn't want to go and say, "Hey, where is he? Wait, what I don't see?" No, and one thing leads to another, and many years later, the story being told is that they were all eating fish, and Jesus appeared to them, right? Something like that. So what do you think about this scenario?
Well, the analogy you give or the example of in certain charismatic circles today where they're speaking in tongues and having ecstatic kind of experiences, you're right in noting that they say that is a manifestation of the Holy Spirit among them. None of them are really saying that this is Jesus appearing to them. Even in the New Testament, when you have Paul talking about the gifts of the Holy Spirit, speaking in tongues, prophetic utterances, these are never regarded as appearances of Jesus. They are manifestations of the Holy Spirit in the gifts of the Spirit. In the book of Acts, when they break out speaking in tongues, at Pentecost, 50 days after Passover, and what's called the Gentile Pentecost in Acts 10, when Cornelius and those with them began speaking in tongues when they received the Holy Spirit, it's a manifestation of the Holy Spirit. It's not an appearance of Jesus. So they were able to distinguish, those early Christians were able to distinguish things like that. That's different than saying Jesus appeared to them, bodily raised from the dead, right? Also, if you have, let's say, Peter saying, "Hey, I see Jesus," and the others feel pressured to say it, when it comes down and they are suffering, enduring great persecution, if they're really doubting about this, are they going to be willing to go through all of that? Why do we not even hear of any defection of any of these disciples defecting and giving up their faith and saying, "Well, I'm not sure I saw him after all. And maybe you'd say, well, maybe the Christians just didn't report it, and that's a possibility. Although I will say that Christians, the gospel authors and Book of Acts, they don't seem to hesitate to do things like that. They're talking about how Peter denied Jesus, that Jesus' brothers didn't believe in him. They're not at all hesitant to talk about how Judas defected and left them and even betrayed Jesus. So they don't seem to be hesitant to say that some people who had been following Jesus abandoned him and gave up belief in him when he started teaching things like, the Eucharist, or, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, which he's speaking, of course, in metaphorical terms. But unless you do that, you have no part in me. And they didn't like that teaching, and several left at that point. So they don't seem to shy away from saying things like that. And I don't think that they would, I don't suspect that they would if some of the other disciples had left Jesus. But there's no accounts anywhere of any of the disciples giving up their discipleship and following Jesus, afterward, having second thoughts. Well, that would almost certainly be the case if you're talking about some nebulous kind of mystical experience that kind of like, well, I'm forcing myself to believe this. It's like of the 11 people who are said to have seen the golden plates of the Book of Mormon, I think 8 of them ended up, wishy-washy back and forth after Joseph Smith's death, whether they stayed with Mormonism. Some of them stayed, some left and came back, but it wasn't the same kind of Mormonism that Joseph Smith had talked about. So, yeah, so I don't think that would work too well. And then you got to explain Paul, right? Why did he convert to Christianity? He had been persecuting the church. He was trying to destroy the movement that Jesus had started. And now he converts to becoming a Christian, gives up everything. In fact, in Philippians, he says, I have suffered the loss of all things on account of Christ, and count all of that as garbage in order that I may gain Christ. So why would he do that based on their testimony? I mean, even their testimony, even if they were testifying with confidence they'd seen the risen Jesus, I don't think that would have motivated Paul. It was the appearance of what he perceived to be an appearance of Jesus to himself that led to his conversion. So I don't know. I think there's some real problems with that view.
Okay, but you say that you don't believe that a realistic enough hallucination to Paul, right? We're speaking about Paul.
Okay.
To himself. Paul. Let's say, I need an auxiliary hypothesis to explain Paul. I need to posit that he had his own hallucination, right?
Yeah.
But if it's to himself, I think sometimes the brain can do weird things, and maybe if it's like if it feels real enough, it could be. And who knows? I don't know. Maybe Paul, we don't know, but maybe Paul was having strong doubts, was strongly considering and thinking a lot about Christianity in the time before that. Maybe, I don't know. We don't really. He doesn't mention that, but we don't really know like what was going on in his mind. So
Yeah, we can consider possibilities. Of course, it's ad hoc, pure speculation. What we do know from what Paul talks about is I think it's Philippians chapter 3, where he kind of gives his resume. He says, circumcised the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Jew's Jew, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to the righteousness in the law, the Jewish law, blameless. So he's given all these. He seems proud, like he was proud of his resume of where he was prior to Christianity, prior to meeting Jesus. There's no sense of guilt there. So to speculate and say, well, he was feeling guilty or having doubts or something, okay, that's speculation. Could it be true? Could be. But it is pure speculation, and therefore it suffers from being greatly ad hoc and goes against what Paul even says about himself. Plus, here you have to think about the complex hypothesis you have to come up with now. You've got the disciples, individuals, and groups experiencing hallucinations of Jesus. Group hallucinations are extremely rare, probably impossible. So you'd be saying, okay, someone like Peter experienced the hallucination of Jesus, and then out of guilt, all the rest of them, they thought, they forced themselves to think that they saw Jesus, even more so in the group appearances. And then Paul, he wasn't grieving Jesus' death, but he experienced a hallucination of Jesus being raised from the dead, even though that would go entirely counter to what he would have expected at the time. And then you got to posit someone stole the body. And so you have this cascade of low probability events, that some of them happening not just once, but again and again to different people and in different settings. It seems to me that such a hypothesis has an extremely low plausibility and involves a ton of speculation. Then you have the alternative, Jesus rose from the dead, which seems to fit pretty well.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I also don't like to posit like too many hallucinations, because I do think that each in one that you need, each extra one that you need, it does reduce a lot, like the overall probability of your hypothesis. And that's why sometimes I actually think of another possibility is, what if the disciples did lie to Paul? And what Komarsky says is that they will have lied to establish authority. It will be like Philip didn't see Jesus. Paul will be like, he didn't appear to you. I mean, he even appeared to me. So people will say like, oh, Paul is more important than Philip. So they will be like, to avoid this kind of thing, let's say he appeared to all of us. Or another hypothesis. This is my own personal proposal. I call it the partial lie hypothesis.
Okay.
And it's the idea that the disciples did had a genuine belief in the resurrection, a belief. They did honestly believe in the resurrection. But also at the same time, when telling the stories to the others, they felt they allowed themselves to lie in some parts to make their case more convincing. They felt no problem with that. So maybe they thought, okay, we believe in that, but maybe other people will not understand it. Let's make it more convincing. And maybe they end up making up stories about group appearances and stuff like that. So maybe they tell some lies, impartial lies. I mean, what do you think about this idea?
Well, let's talk about first, did the disciples lie to Paul, and that led him to believe Jesus rose? The apostles were already out proclaiming Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. So we got to ask, while they're doing this, what was Paul doing before he converted? Tell me, Juan, what was Paul doing before he converted to Christianity?
He was persecuting Christians.
Okay. And why was he doing that?
Because the Jewish authorities gave him that job, right?
Okay. And why would he have taken that? And why were the Jewish authorities wanting to persecute the Christians?
Well, the Jewish authorities wanted to persecute the Christians because they saw him as blasphemous, as a Jewish sect that was like separating from them in a way, from Judaism. Yeah, I think they would have been illegal, would have been committing blasphemy in a way, I think. Yeah.
Okay, fair. That's good.
Yeah.
So do you think, since we can be pretty certain that they are proclaiming Jesus rose and appeared to them, do you think Paul would have heard that message?
Well, no. Before he has his hallucination, no.
You don't think he would have known that the disciples were out proclaiming Jesus had been raised and appeared to them?
Someone would have told him that, yes.
Okay. I mean, he's in Jerusalem for a while. I mean, that's where he was as a Pharisee. He's in Jerusalem. So they are proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus first in Jerusalem. He doesn't like their message. He would have known their message. They're proclaiming the gospel message. Jesus died, rose from the dead, and appeared. So if they're telling Paul, hey, he appeared to us, well, he already knew that. And he would have thought that they were lying or that they had experienced hallucinations. So that wouldn't have moved Paul to convert to Christianity. It was because Paul himself had an experience that he interpreted as the risen Jesus appearing to him. That is what transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, the partial lie hypothesis, in which they lied in some of the details about, say, they had private hallucinations, but the group appearances, I think that's what you said, the group experiences were lies.
Yeah.
Well, you do have the tradition in 1 Corinthians 15:6, where he says, that goes back probably to the Jerusalem apostles, where it says, then he appeared to more than 500 at one time. And then Paul adds his parenthetical statement, most of these people are still alive, though some have died, which seems to suggest that, and this was probably an appearance that happened in Jerusalem, which means that in Jerusalem, there were still hundreds of people who had, at the single event, had experienced something that they all interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus to them. And these people could still be interviewed and tell of what that experience was like. So that wouldn't have been something that the apostles would have invented, because people were still around. You could say they invented it, I suppose, and then it's this huge conspiracy theory that involved not only the apostles, but also hundreds of people who agreed to testify about this single experience that they had all witnessed. That seems improbable to me.
Yeah.
Possible,
Yeah.
yes. But you see, this is all just, it all gets, you have to put all of this together into a single hypothesis. Someone stole the body, they invented the group appearances, some hallucinated, they lied to Paul, they lied to others, and you got this really complex hypothesis. Every bit of it has to work in order for the hypothesis to succeed, and some of the elements of it are rare. It's very ad hoc, and some elements implausible. And again, it's a very complex hypothesis. In contrast, you got a very simple hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead. And the only problem with that is it involves the miraculous, right? So if you have an atheist who is, or even let's say a Muslim, who either philosophically or theologically are disinclined to believe that either God exists, or if he did, he wouldn't raise Jesus from the dead, that's mainly the only objection against that. I mean, if I were a skeptic, I think the only reasonable explanation that a skeptic could give would be, look, I have to acknowledge, if I'm being honest, the evidence for the resurrection is pretty good, but it's just not strong enough to convince me to go against my philosophical or theological convictions. My metaphysical or theological bias is against the resurrection of Jesus, because what it would imply to my worldview. To me, that would be an honest, respectable position that a skeptic could hold, better than some of the naturalistic hypotheses that have been posited to explain away the data.
Right. I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I think at the end, the debate will always boil down to the skeptic will propose a naturalistic explanation. The Christian will say, okay, that's very unlikely. And the skeptic will say, even then, for me, the a priori probability of the resurrection is even more unlikely. So I will go with this one. It seems like it always boils down to that. I want to ask about this at the end when we get into David Hume's argument against miracles, because I think this may be the most important part of the debate, right? Now, in some way. But also, you were mentioning the appearance of the 500, right? I read Del Allison's book. I mean, he seems very skeptic that this is a good argument. I don't know. I don't really have all of the top of my head all of the arguments, but he says that he doesn't really believe this is a good one.
Yeah.
Like many things we don't know about that. So I don't know.
So Dale says that the appearance to the more than 500, he says that the term that's the Greek term that is translated there, more than epano, that can also be translated as above, the word above. It's true. It can mean above, or it could be more than. All English translations has it as more than. And he says that he thinks Paul invented that part or added that part. Not that Paul didn't believe it, but he thinks that Paul added that part to the oral tradition that had been handed down to him. So it ended at verse 5. Okay, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 5, and then Paul added 6 and 7 and 8 to that, 8 about the appearance to himself. But here's the thing. Epano is a non-Pauline term. It only appears there in 1 Corinthians 15, what is it, 6, verse 6. He appeared to more than 500 at one time. So Paul, when he is speaking of things above, he uses the Greek phrase entois epuranios, in the heavenlies. So it seems that if he was and what Dale says, he appeared above to more than 500. He thinks that the appearance was some kind of cloud formation that these people looked at and said, "Oh, look, it's Jesus."
I see.
Yeah, I mean, that seems a bit of a stretch to me. And again, he bases that, he wants to retranslate epano as above, and he thinks that's Paul added that, but again, that's not a Pauline term. And if that's the case, he could have used that, what the appearance to himself, because the way the appearance to Paul is described in the book of Acts, that would have fit perfectly with that, but he doesn't use that. So I think that doesn't really work. And to say it was just a cloud formation, that's really stretching it, in my opinion, at least.
Yeah. I agree. That was interesting. Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to go to. You also have a book on the topic of contradictions. I read it, and I think it was a great book. I think it offers a very interesting response to many of the apparent problems and contradictions in the Gospels. And because Bart Ehrman and many skeptics, they do focus a lot on contradiction, on gospel contradiction. That's like the very first thing they're going to say if they're going to attack the Gospels: contradictions. So and you have your own approach to this, the one about literally devices, which I think is very good, because I also agree with you that sometimes apologists, they come up with harmonization that are like a stretch of plausibility. They're very strange, but you have a very interesting approach. So for me, these are the three strongest contradictions in the Gospels. The one of how many angels at the tomb, second is the flight to Egypt, and the third is Judas' death. So for the one on the angels and the tomb, for example, we have Mark saying one angel, and Matthew also saying one angel, and we have Luke and John saying two angels. Mm-hmm. And your solution is to talk about the device of spotlighting, which is basically when the author focuses on a character. But I'm not personally, I'm not sure if that's like exactly the same, because when I think about spotlight, it's just focusing on one character. For example, let's take another example. When Jesus and there is curses the fig tree, and the text says the disciples and Jesus walked by a tree, and Jesus looked at a tree. There is a plural to singular change, so the text focuses on Jesus, right? Nobody.
Wait a minute, you lost me.
Yeah.
Would you back up and say that again?
Yeah. So the part when Jesus walks with the disciples and they see a tree, the text says,
and they see what?
A fig tree.
A fig tree. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, and the text says that he was with the disciples and they walked by, and then Jesus saw a tree. So it focuses on Jesus. It spotlights Jesus in this moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Jesus is being spotlighted. So but nobody is saying that's a contradiction, right?
Right.
Because I mean, because it doesn't one doesn't negate the other one. But it seems to me like the one in the angels, it is like weird. It feels weird to me that like one denies the other one. Like if we look at Mark, the wording, it says the woman looked back and she saw one angel, right? But if she was,
does it say they saw one angel?
Yeah, I have the word in here exactly. I have the word in here. Mark.
Okay. Give me the text. Mark what? 16 what?
Oh, I have to check it out. I don't know. Mark 16. Maybe it's on the screen.
It says verse 5.
Yeah.
And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. And he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here." Okay. Yeah. Okay.
So it seems to me like it's weird to word it like this. When they entered, they saw two angels. They must have seen two angels. So why would he say they entered the tomb and they saw one angel? It seems to me like it is denying too strongly the two angels. In a way, it doesn't feel to me like it's just spotlighting. It feels to me like it's really denying the other thing in a way. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, fair enough. It's a possibility in that case. Then you'd have Luke and John who would be adding an angel for effect, if that were the case. I guess we could look at it and say, look what happens in the rest of the resurrection narratives. Okay, so in John, or Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you have multiple women go to the tomb, but in John, it says Mary Magdalene got up early and went to the tomb and found it empty. Does that sound like one, or could there be more?
It sounds like one.
Yeah. Right. I agree. Yeah. And she sees the tomb empty and she runs back to Peter and the beloved disciple and she says, "Hey, they've taken the Lord and we don't know where they've laid him." So it seems like she's referring to multiple women. You say, well, maybe she could be thinking about Peter and the beloved disciple as well. Well, of course they wouldn't know. They didn't even know the tomb was empty until
I have one possibility there. Maybe she talked to a few people outside, a few followers of Jesus, and she was like, "Hey, do you know about the body of Jesus?" And they say no. And that's why she went to the Peter and says, "We." I mean, it's a bit of a making up a scenario, just like apology. But
sure, it probably would be just as innovative as the we referring to the other women as well. Okay, I'll give that to you. Here's another possible. You've got literary spotlighting in the resurrection narratives. So when Mary comes back and says in John, they've taken the Lord and we don't know where they've laid him, you have Peter and the beloved disciple who get up and they run to the tomb and see it. And, it says the beloved disciple believed, but Peter, he went back to his home kind of confused. When you read the same account in Luke 24, I believe it's verse 12, it says, when the women came, Peter got up and ran to the tomb and found it empty and then was confused and went home. That leads you to believe there was just one. But then 12 verses later, you have the Emmaus disciples. They say, "Hey, the women said that they saw angels at the tomb." And then some of our own, plural, some of our own went to the tomb and found it as the women had said. Seems that that could be very compatible with what you find in John's gospel with Peter and the beloved disciple going to the tomb. Now, I guess you could say, well, Peter went first and then he came back and then some others went, but that is certainly compatible with the literary spotlighting. And when I read through Plutarch's lives and really focused on compositional devices in them, what I found is that literary spotlighting occurs among Plutarch's lives and how he tells the story in multiple lives. It occurred more than any other compositional device that I found. And let's face it, we do the same thing today in our everyday, ordinary conversation. I mean, I could think of a hypothetical. Maybe I go to the mall and I see my neighbor Diane, and she'd been on vacation, her and her husband on vacation for a while. And I go and I see her in the mall. I see her and her sister and her sister's daughter. I see them at the mall. And I come back and I tell my wife and I say, hey, I know Diane and her husband have been on vacation for a while. Well, I just saw Diane at the mall. Okay, I just mentioned Diane because I knew that she and her husband had been on vacation. I just saw her. Now, I had also seen her sister and her sister's daughter, but I don't mention them. I'm doing literary spotlighting. So we do this today in our everyday, ordinary conversations. Plutarch did it all the time in his writings, and we can look at multiple examples in the Gospels, even outside the resurrection narratives, where they do this. So I agree with you that in Mark's account, it sounds, he talks about, it seems, he only mentions the one angel who's sitting in the tomb and talked about it. Did he know that there were others? To our eye, it would seem a reading would more clearly suggest he only had one angel in view. And again, in that case, then you would just say that Luke and John added another angel for effect. Or you could say, yeah, he knew of two, but he's shining his literary spotlight on just that one. Just like, I'll give one other example in the Gospels, the centurion. So in Luke's gospel, you have the centurion go to Jesus. You have the centurion, he sends some Jewish elders to Jesus to ask Jesus to come and heal his servant. And then on their way back, the centurion has a change of heart and he sends some friends out to intercept Jesus and say, look, I'm unworthy for you to come under my house. Let me just, you're a man of authority just like me. Just, speak the word and my servant will be healed. And so Jesus goes and, he speaks the word. He praises the centurion for his faith and heals his servant without ever even going to see him. But in Matthew's gospel, the centurion himself goes. So he eliminates the Jewish elders. He eliminates the friends. He just has the centurion himself. He's shining a spotlight on the centurion, even though he knows that others had been there, multiple people. So, yeah, I don't know. What you posited could be possible, but I think that literary spotlighting is, in my view, is a better explanation for it.
Yeah. I will grant you that you have some good examples of spotlighting in the Gospels and also in Plutarch. You have one example in your book on Cicero going to the house to deliver a letter, and one story says he went alone. The other guy says he went with other guys, right? The other story, and it's the same person, right?
Yes, Crassus going to Cicero's house, and on another occasion he took two others. So that would be literary spotlighting. Yeah, good example.
Yeah, that's good. The only thing that I may offer a bit of pushback is, for example, in your example of the supermarket, the reason why you say, I met Diana in the supermarket is because the family is less important in the context, so you can kind of omit her. But when you say, if two angels come down from heaven, now to say one angel when came down, that is weird in a way. Like, why would you think the other angel was not important? It is. It's a little like, why would you not mention the second angel? This feels different to me in a way. Like, that's too important to omit, right? To just omit like that. I think, yeah.
Yeah, it would seem that way. It would seem, too important to us. Angels appearing. I mean, that'd be pretty big. That'd be a life changer to see something like that. And if there were two of them, to just mention the one, I would think you'd mention the two. But I guess the question is what Mark thought at that time. And sometimes they do things that, that we wouldn't expect. It's like, well, why doesn't Mark, if it's based on the appearances of, if it's based on the testimony of Peter, then why does it mention Peter walking on water and then doubting, Or why is it that none of Jesus' brothers believed in him before the so-called resurrection? I struggled with that. It's like, well, gee, if he was born of a virgin, his brothers would later hear that from their parents. Why would they not believe in Jesus? It's funny, I was at lunch with a skeptic once, and he said, there's still questions that you have. And I said, yeah, it's like, I don't understand why his brothers didn't believe in him if Jesus was truly born of a virgin and was perfect and sinless. They would have grown up. They would have seen what he was like. They would have heard stories from his parents. And the skeptic said, nah, I don't struggle with that. I said, really? He said, yeah, if I had a brother that was perfect, I'd hate him. So it's like some of us are bothered by some things that, not of others. Sometimes we do things that we don't understand. Sometimes others do things that we don't understand. I've been married to my wife now for 39 years. And I knew her for a year and a half before we were married. We've been living together for 39 years. So I can tell you she still does things that confuse me, and I don't understand why. So it could be that way, with Mark and Matthew writing just, one angel. But, I give that to you that a reading of the text as we read it in Mark, it does seem like if there were two angels, why would he just mention one? But that even so, I'll tell you what, let's do this. Let's just say that the angels, I don't think this, but let's just say the angels were invented as a literary device here. Probably are aware of what I think about Matthew 27, verses 51 through 53, that Matthew is using a kind of poetic effects there with some of the things like the saints being raised. So what if he was doing something similar with the angels? You still got an empty tomb. You still have the appearances of Jesus. The angels were just added in order to show the significance of this and to make clear why the tomb was empty. Now, I don't think that's what happened, but if that's what happened, wouldn't really challenge the resurrection, would it?
I mean, the way I see it is what one of your points earlier was that the Gospels go back directly to direct eyewitnesses, like Mark go back to the disciples. Okay, but if we see in the Gospels signs that some things are invented, now that opens a kind of world where you say, okay, if some things are being invented, what else is invented? There's something like that.
So if I were to say that, now Juan, where do you live? Can I ask you that?
In Germany.
Germany, okay. So you're familiar what happened over here on September 11th, 2001, right? With 9/11?
Yeah.
Okay. So what if we're talking and I say, 9/11 was an earth-shaking event?
Yeah.
You don't interpret that as there was a massive earthquake that was found around the world.
Yeah, obviously.
Right?
That's right.
Sometimes we use some language like that. I have a friend who's a physician, and she shares the gospel. She has a ministry. She shares the gospel with Muslims. And in 2022, she sent me a Facebook message on this shortly right after it happened. And in the spring of 2022, she sent me a text or a message on Facebook and said, hey, I was just at the Persian, I think it was the Tajiks, who are Persians, they had just had a festival celebrating the Persian New Year. And she said, at one point, an announcer stopped everything and said, we just want to take a moment and remember it was one of their famous singers, a guy who had in 2020 been tragically killed in a car accident. And she said, the announcer said, when that happened, the sun went dark and stars fell out of the sky. So using this phenomenological language, this poetic kind of language to add emphasis to a tragic event or an event that had great significance. So we wouldn't look at that and say, look, that happened and therefore legend was added and we really can't trust the reliability of that announcer because that announcer did that to history. No, we'd say, hey, we recognize that. Well, did Jews and Christians add angels to something in order to highlight the significance? You had Raymond Brown, the great Catholic scholar, who argued that yes. Now, I didn't buy his arguments for that, but if that happened, that still would not undermine the general reliability of those accounts.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. Yeah, one could say that. So, what about another contradiction? You talk about this one in your channel recently, the one of the flight to Egypt. You say this is one of the difficult ones.
Yeah.
In in Matthew, Mary and Joseph were in Bethlehem, and they were warned by an angel not to return to Nazareth, so they went to Egypt instead.
Yes.
What is the problem? The problem is that they look. It's not just that Luke omits that. It's that there is a part in Luke chapter 2, verse 39, where Luke says explicitly, when they were done with all the required rituals, they returned to Nazareth. So Luke seems to explicitly say, okay, when they were done presenting Jesus at the temple, they went to Nazareth. But in Matthew, it doesn't match. From Nazareth to they went to Egypt, right? From Bethlehem, they went to Egypt, right? So you had a response to that. Maybe you would like to share it.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. If you look at that and you're going to look at the way that is narrated in a literal sense, a hard literal sense, you got a contradiction there. So what could be happening? If I had to guess, I think what Luke is doing there for, Matthew, for him, he takes things in Jesus's life and he tries to show that Jesus is a type of new Moses. So for example, he takes the Sermon on the Mount, which Luke puts on a plain, and Matthew puts it at the top of a mountain. In my opinion, Matthew has changed the location from the plain to the top of the mountain because he wants to do a symbolic thing here to say, as God gave the law to Moses at the top of Mount Zion, Jesus is interpreting the law at the top of the mountain. So that's how he shows Jesus as a new Moses. And it's like, as Moses led the people out of Egypt, Jesus came out of Egypt when Herod died, Herod the Great died. And so in that way, he resembles Moses. He's a new Moses. My thoughts, if I had to guess, I would say that I think Luke, because Luke isn't concerned about making that new Moses because he's writing for Gentiles, specifically Theophilus. Since he's writing for Gentiles, he doesn't try to make this new Moses theme in his gospel. And so the time in Egypt is irrelevant to him. So he just kind of cuts it out of there and he just goes straight from Jesus's dedication 40 days after his birth, and he's being dedicated in the temple in Jerusalem. And from there, boom, he just goes straight to Nazareth. Luke doesn't see any need to do that, so he just cuts it out of there. And you do have some stuff like this in other Gospels where you displace events and compress events. I mean, the thing you mentioned, the fig tree, Jesus cursing the fig tree. In Mark's Gospel, he curses the fig tree on Monday, and it's not until the next morning on Tuesday that they notice that the tree has withered and died. But Matthew, he compresses the events, and he just has it where the fig tree is cursed on Monday, and immediately, like right before their eyes, it withers and dies. He compresses and conflates events in terms of the temple being cleansed. So in Mark's Gospel, he walks into the temple complex on Sunday. He looks around and it's late, so he just looks around and then he leaves. And then he comes back Monday, and that's when he sees some things he doesn't like, and he cleanses the temple. But Matthew, he conflates those and compresses the time involved. So Jesus walks into the temple on Sunday, and that's when he sees stuff going on he doesn't approve of, and he cleanses the temple on Sunday. So you got some compression and conflation there. So my guess is Luke is doing that a little bit with, the Egypt thing and what's going on right after Jesus was dedicated. They, instead of going to Egypt, they go to Nazareth. But that's my guess. I don't know that that's the case. Otherwise, you do have, and even if that were true, even if what I'm speculating here is true, you still, if you take things in a very literal sense, you got a contradiction.
Yeah, you talk about that in your book about this compression device. It's it shows up a lot, and it's a great book. I'm also going to to link to that one in the description. Yeah, I bought it and I read it, and it was great. So I highly recommend it. And maybe the last contradiction is a super popular one, the Judas death contradiction. So there are several things. One, there is like an apparent contradiction in how Judas died, but there are other things. The text contradicts on why the field is known as the field of blood, and also the text contradicts on who bought the field. But I think there is something interesting here. Is that the skeptic does have something to explain when the skeptic is saying, no, that's a contradiction. But what is Luke even saying when he says that Judas fell and burst? Because was he saying that Judas was walking and he tripped and fell and he just burst? Like, that doesn't happen, right? Mm-hmm. And it's funny because that is precisely what will happen if the apologists are correct, that Judas hanged himself and eventually his body fell and burst, that's like the normal harmonization for this case. I think everyone knows this harmonization. This is a classic example of harmonization.
Right.
But I think that doesn't really, okay, even if we grant you that those are okay, you still have the problem of why is the field known as field of blood and who bought the field. I think those are other elements in the story that contradict. So what do you think?
Well, in terms of who bought the field and so forth, I guess I'd have to look at that that part a little bit more before I'd comment on it. Of course, we're not talking about a contradiction between the Gospels. It would be between I think it's Matthew who says he hung himself, and then Acts, right? So, but in terms of the hanging, I don't know exactly what happened there. You got, I think Matthew says he hanged himself, and then Luke says he fell headlong and he burst wide open. Now, more recently, I've looked at this, and I don't really have so much a problem with that anymore. Luke, at times, he will skip over certain things and just talk about something else. Like, I think it's Luke chapter 9, verse 51. He says, when the time was approaching for Jesus's ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. Okay, when the time was approaching for Jesus's ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. Does that mean that Luke didn't know about Jesus's death and crucifixion? Because those were really important events and they happened before the ascension. Why does he just mention the ascension? Well, because that's what he does. And Luke is obviously aware of the death and resurrection of Jesus because he mentions them in chapters 23 and 24. So he's just mentioning more or less the end result there. He skips the death and resurrection of Jesus, as important as they were. I mean, he could have said when the time was approaching for Jesus's death and resurrection, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. But no, he skips that and says when the time was approaching for Jesus's ascension, he was determined to go to Jerusalem. So what could be happening here is Matthew mentions the hanging of Judas, and Luke skips the actual hanging, and he only mentions the part where Judas falls down, maybe because the rope or the branch broke and as he went tumbling down. Or it could be that after they took the body down, as one early church father, I forgot who it was, but as one early church father reports, when they took the body down and they put it on a cart to take it away, the body, due to decomposition, was bloated and it fell off the cart, and that's when it split open. To me, that seems plausible. If he'd been up there for a while, hanging, and then they removed the corpse, which was now bloated, it could have split open. Especially if it fell off and started rolling down a hill, it could have easily split open. So I don't see that as problematic anymore. I didn't have a good explanation for that for a while, and it's like, well, I don't know, maybe that is a contradiction. I don't think the falling and his intestines split and his body splitting open is a problem anymore. The stuff about who bought the field and so forth, I'd have to relook at that again. But again, even if you got a minor detail wrong here, I mean, you get some stuff wrong. I mean, all ancient historians and even modern historians will make some kind of minor errors. You can still have the general reliability of a text without having it inerrant.
Yeah, I do agree that this could be also like minor errors, right? I haven't even considered that because I'm so used to normal apologists who insist that there can be no kinds of errors, right? But when you think about it, maybe Luke made a mistake, somehow got the story wrong. Yeah, maybe, right? Some details. Okay. And that's that. Now we can go to the last question, the last topic. So what do you think about David Hume's arguments against miracles in general? The point. Like I will give you my own position on this. I am not like, I think some skeptics like exaggerate on this. They take it like it's a kind of like a law of logic. It was like a law of logic to say that no, miracles cannot be possible. It has to be the naturalistic explanation. But I don't agree with that. Of course, there is a point where the naturalistic explanation is too absurd, right? But nevertheless, I think it is fair to say that in general, like a scenario where somebody lies or is mistaken or something weird, some weird confusion happens, it seems like this is much more likely a priori than a scenario where a miracle happens, a resurrection from the dead happens, and one should like prefer that. So, and that's the skeptic's argument. So what would you say about this?
Well, I think that can apply, and that could be true. You could say it. I think it'd be a more plausible explanation to account for maybe one or two of the things. Maybe you say, well, maybe Peter lied. But what do you do with all the rest of them? Why does James, the brother of Jesus, who appears to be a non-believer prior to the resurrection, he's a non-believer all the way up to the time of Jesus's death. Why is it that he becomes a believer afterward to the point where he's willing to be martyred because he would not deny that his brother had been the Messiah? What would lead to that? What would lead to Paul converting because he believes the risen Jesus appeared to him? So, yeah, you could say lied. One of them did, but all of them? And again, you got to account for, well, how did the tomb get empty? If you're granting the empty tomb, how did the tomb get empty? Why did Paul convert when they were skeptics, when they were non-believers up through the time of Jesus's death? you still have to come up, Hume would still have to come up with some kind of a very complex combination hypothesis, of which some of these things are occurring on multiple occasions, in different scenarios to different people for different reasons. It just seems that Hume would be forced to come up with this hypothesis that, requires multiple things to happen. All of them must happen, and some of them would be exceptionally rare, but they're all happening in order for it to happen. Why? Well, because he just can't stomach that God intervened. I mean, that's what it boils down to. He just can't stomach the conclusion that maybe God acted in the situation. You say, well, resurrections, well, won't they be very rare? Yep. But are they improbable? Well, they're improbable by natural explanation or natural causes, of course. But if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then the probability of the resurrection is 100%. So I don't find Hume's, he gives several arguments, of course, against miracles. I don't find any of them to be persuasive. And in fact, a lot of even atheists today reject Hume. They come up with other reasons or other ways to try to say, like Bart Ehrman, he'll say, you shouldn't believe the resurrection. You can't establish it historically because either he'll say a miracle by its very definition is the least probable explanation. Historians must choose the most probable, therefore they can't say the resurrection. To which I'd say, well, improbable, you say it's the least probable explanation. Least probable in reference to what? Least probable in reference to Jesus being raised naturally. Well, yeah, I agree. But Jesus being raised by God, well, what's so improbable about that? If God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, you would need to argue that God doesn't exist, and if he did, he would not want to raise Jesus. Well, such would be inscrutable, you would say. And so I think that's a flawed explanation. The other one he gives would be if Jesus was raised from the dead or a miracle happened, it would require God, and historians don't have the tools to investigate God. Now, that's not a Humean argument, that's an Ehrman argument. And since historians don't have the tools to investigate or confirm God, they can never confirm that Jesus was raised. And I just disagree with that. The example I would give is, if a comet slammed into the moon's surface and left the message in the lunar surface that said, Jesus is Lord, written in Hebrew and in Greek, a good scientist, an astronomer might say, that's an extraordinary event. It would seem to require God. I have no plausible natural explanations for it, but I also have no tools to detect God as the cause. So I'm limited here. I can only acknowledge that the event occurred, but I'm going to have to leave the cause of the event undetermined. I think in a similar way, the historian could look at the data and say, wow, it seems to point to the extraordinary event of Jesus returning to life. That would seem to require God, and I have no plausible natural explanations for it, but I also don't have any tools of a historian to confirm that God is the cause. So I'm just going to have to acknowledge the occurrence that Jesus did come back to life, probably, but I'm going to have to leave the cause undetermined. I think that's would be a reasonable response to Ehrman's claim. But again, just finally, if I were a skeptic, I wouldn't be doing any of that stuff. I just think all of those explanations or rebuttals to the resurrection fail. I think if I were a skeptic, the only thing I'd be left with that would be reasonable would be to say, well, I think the most reasonable thing would be to say Jesus rose from the dead and become a Christian. But I think a skeptic could be, a reasonable explanation would be to say, yeah, the evidence points to the resurrection. I just, I've got my worldview is that God does not exist, or if he does, he doesn't do miracles, and there's just not enough evidence to convince me that Jesus was raised. I don't know what happened. I mean, that was kind of the position of Geza Vermesh, skeptical Jewish New Testament scholar. To me, that seems to be the most reasonable position if you're going to remain a skeptic. But that's just me. I'm not a skeptic.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let me just say one thing to that. When you say like, I need to posit a situation that is very unlikely, that the probability of that happening is just that and that and that and that. And that's so many unlikely, right? I have to say, okay, let's say I agree to that. Sure. But here's the thing. I think it's super unlikely. This situation is super unlikely. It may not happen every day, but I only need it to happen once in all of human history, right? So even if it's that unlikely, okay, like how long have humans been around? How big is the world? Like in all of human history, at some point it could happen, right? So I would say something like that, right?
Okay, so you acknowledge that it's an extremely improbable event. And so then I'd say, okay, well, it's possible. It's extremely improbable, but it's possible. The alternative is Jesus rose from the dead. Is that extremely improbable? Well, if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, it's extremely probable that it happened. You say, well, for that, you'd have to know that God exists and wanted to raise Jesus. Well, I do think that there's good evidence that God exists. For some, it's not going to be compelling enough, but I think an honest skeptic would have to say, there is some decent evidence for God's existence.
I agree. Yeah, sure.
Jesus comes on the scene. I think there's good historical evidence to suggest that he claimed to be God's uniquely divine son, that God had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that he performed deeds. Well, most historians, even skeptics, agree that Jesus did perform deeds that astonished crowds and that he was believed to be, by many, a miracle worker and exorcist during his lifetime. They'll think that it's magic or something, kind of like expectations on the part of those who experience a miracle, but it wasn't really a miracle. But they do acknowledge that he did perform deeds that astonished crowds and things like that. But you put all those things together, and it does create some background knowledge that adds some plausibility to reason to think that God would want to raise Jesus if he truly was the Son of God, and if those astonishing deeds were actually divine miracles, we would have reason to think God would want to raise him.
Yeah, that's a good response. I think that's great. Yeah, I will agree that maybe one can believe that there are some good reasons to believe that there may be a God, right? Where he will want to specifically raise Jesus from the dead. Right now, that's not so easy, like
Right.
because you will have to. It's like out of all people in the world, like a priori, what is the probability that's going to be? Just like a priori, right? Not a posteriori. Like a priori is like the same for everyone in a way, for every religion. So do you have any a priori reasons that God would want to specifically raise the Jewish Messiah? I mean, before you look at the evidence for Jesus, I mean, it's not so easy, but yeah, I think there are some good points there. Yeah.
I think at the end, Juan, for me, I do think that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for the data. But even so, if a person doesn't want to buy that, I think that the honest skeptic could at least look and see, you know what? It's not enough to convince me, but Christians can certainly be reasonable in believing that Jesus rose from the dead.
Yeah, I think I will be fine with that. I mean, something similar along the lines of Dale Allison, right? He says, I think both people can look at the data and not be like super unreasonable, right? I could be okay with that. Yeah. So I think that's all I wanted to ask you. So do you have any final words that you want to like close to the audience or something, anything else you want to add before we
Well, it's been
finish?
delightful talking with you, Juan, and I wish you the best. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thank you.
I would just encourage people, especially as we're coming up on Easter, consider the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. What's wonderful about it is if Jesus rose from the dead, it does mean that God loves us. It's a revelation of God to us to tell us a little about who God is, what he what he expects of us, how we can have eternal life. I mean, if atheism is true, then it's like all the evil that happens in the world, it's just senseless. we might have some kind of subjective meaning to life, but there's no ultimate meaning to life. If we're all just here by chance chemical combinations, is to say that there is some kind of a lawgiver that transcends all of nature. And that makes sense of God, and it makes sense of our lives and why we do think that there is some kind of an objective morality, why that's truly wrong, while slavery, while cold-blooded murder is wrong. These things are truly wrong. It makes sense of morality if God truly exists. So yeah, I think Christianity makes a whole lot of sense, especially if Jesus rose from the dead. Makes a whole lot of sense of a lot of things.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was a great. Okay, thank you guys. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you, Dr. Licona, also for coming to the channel. And please subscribe to the channel and make sure to check out Mike's channel. I'm also going to put a link to that. And see you next time. Bye.
Thanks, Juan.